for arranging to have me to come out here tonight. I appreciate those of you who came out. So you're going to get the same lecture as if I had 150 people here. Okay? I want to tell you a little something about me before I start. I was born in 1945, just as my father returned home from 5 years of naval service as a ship's doctor in World War II. My parents were Dr. Harvey and Grace Poliakoff, both of New York City. My father was raised in the Bronx. My mother was raised on Manhattan's Upper West Side. Any New Yorkers here? I figured there'd be at least one or two. And their generation was called by Tom Brokaw the greatest generation. And he called them the greatest generation primarily because they fought and won World War II and maintained freedom in the world. But I also call them the greatest generation because they built most of the houses of worship that we pray in today. I lived on Manhattan's Upper West Side until I was 3 years old. We moved to a place called Rockville Center, Long Island, a suburb. When I was 3, we moved to Rockville Center. In 1973, 40 some odd years ago, I married Judy, who's sitting in the back, who grew up in Winfield, part of Philadelphia. We were married at the old Har Zion Temple in Winfield. Of course, 40 years ago, that temple moved to the suburbs. We've lived in Wynwood, Montgomery County for almost 40 years. We have 2 children, ages 42 and 37, and 2 grandchildren. Now, before I start the lecture, I don't want anybody to go away because it's time to play my favorite game, Guess That Synagogue. And what I'm going to do is, no second.
Your computer had shut down.
Shut down.
I just pushed the power button to restart it.
Guess we're not going to play the game.
Uh-oh.
Oh well.
Just restart it.
His battery is...
The battery's low, that's the problem. We'll see if it goes on. If it does, great. If not, I have plenty to talk about.
Don't you have a power cord with you?
Of course I have a power cord, but it's in my house. Because I charged this morning.
Yes, you're from New York. Yes.
I need to know
Yeah,
what,
it's not gonna go.
what
Do it.
street on the Upper West Side?
103rd and West End.
108 and Riverside.
Okay, very close. So we're not going to play Guess That Synagogue.
Good.
But I'm going to tell you about the book and I'm going to tell you some history. So Synagogues of Philadelphia tells the story of the more than 500 synagogues that either exist today or have existed in Bucks, Chester, Montgomery, Delaware, and Philadelphia counties, the 5-county Pennsylvania, Philadelphia area. Now, Philadelphia has one of the most vibrant Jewish communities in our nation. In the early 1900s, it was second in Jewish population only to New York. Today it's 8th, but it's probably the 4th or 5th most active, because 2 of the ones above them are Houston and Dallas, and it's not like being Jewish in Philadelphia or New York. I can't explain it. The book includes over 150 pictures, including a picture of the old B'nai Jacob, which is a very rare picture, the original building, and reproductions of historical documents along with the histories. Now, everybody asks me when I start, why did you write these books? I mean, I was a small businessman. I was not an author. What happened was, a couple of years ago, I was walking down 6th Street in Philadelphia with my granddaughter. She was, I guess, 6 at the time. And we passed an old building on 6th Street, just on the border of South Philly and Center City. And she noticed that it had Jewish markings into the cement on the side of the building. There was Chanukiah, a Jewish star, a Seder plate, you know, engraved into the building, like you would expect to see in a synagogue. But it was an antique store. She asked me what was going on, and fortunately I knew the answer. So I said to her, this was the old B'nai Reuben, the great Romanian synagogue of Philadelphia. But in 1959, neighborhoods changed. People stopped going to what we used to call ethnocentric synagogues. In other words, if you were Romanian, you went to this shul. If you were Czech, you went to this shul. And they started going by neighborhood instead of by background. So I explained to her what it was. It's for this reason, for her and her children and her grandchildren and your children and grandchildren, that I wrote these books. I take it very seriously. So everybody likes to talk about themselves. They like to talk about their families, their work, their hobbies. And another thing we all like to talk about is the old neighborhood, wherever that is. Whether it was Strawberry Mansion, Winfield, Mount Airy, South Philly, West Philly, Southwest, Oak Lane, or even another suburb. This book lets you look back where you, your parents, or even your grandparents grew up. I've tried to include every synagogue that has ever existed. And I think I've done a pretty good job. The only few that may have been left out were some of the old row house synagogues in South Philly, because there's just no record. If I left one out that you know of, you can let me know by email, so in the second edition we'll include it. So in the book, I talk about the early synagogues in great detail. Does anybody know what was the first synagogue in metropolitan Philadelphia? Okay, nobody knows.
The oldest?
It was Congregation Mikveh Israel, now located at 44 North 4th Street, which is the 5th building they've occupied since they were founded in 1740. It was one of the 7 original colonial synagogues of America. How do we define a colonial synagogue? One that was founded in the 1700s. The other 6 were the Toro Synagogue, also known as Yeshuat Yisrael, which is in Newport, Rhode Island. Also Shirat Yisrael, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in Manhattan. The Lloyd Street Synagogue in Baltimore. Congregation Beth Ahaba'ah of Richmond, Virginia. Congregation Mikveh Israel of Savannah. And Congregation Beth Elohim of Charleston, South Carolina. Now, does anybody have an idea what city in this country had the highest Jewish population in 1800?
Philadelphia.
Charles?
Charleston is correct. Charleston had 3,000 Jews. And at that time, New York had about 2,000, and Philadelphia had about 1,000. There were 2 other early synagogues that just missed. They were founded in 1800, and you're going to get a kick out of where they were. One was Sons of Israel in St. Augustine, Florida, which still exists. And the other, also still exists, Temple Emmanuel of Dothan, Alabama. Now, that's not on the coast, but it was a merchant synagogue. A group of merchants went from New York to Dothan, and the first thing they did was build a synagogue. With the exception of 2 Reform synagogues, Knesset Israel of Elkins Park and Rodef Sholom on North Broad Street in Philadelphia, all of the early synagogues in the 5 counties were Orthodox until 1913. So at that point in time, we had 2 Reform, 0 Conservative, and tons of Orthodox synagogues, including B'nai Jacob of Phoenixville, including Chesed Shalem of Pottstown, all Orthodox at that time. But something amazing happened in 1913. So what happened was a young rabbi named Solomon Schechter was called to New York from England, where he had a reputation as being a scholar, but not necessarily a university leader. And he was called to a sleepy rabbinical training school in Manhattan called the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, which at that time trained Orthodox rabbis and trained them like they were still leading old world synagogues. Everything was taught in Hebrew or Yiddish. The rabbis were not prepared to give sermons in English, and they were not prepared to communicate with the congregation's children who were going to public schools, unlike in Europe where they went to cheder or yeshiva. So Schechter's charge was, change the way we train the rabbis. Don't change the Judaism. You know, we're not looking for a lot of change, because Schechter was not a great proponent of change. And he certainly hated controversy. So what he did was he introduced English. The rabbis were trained to give sermons in English, to converse with the children who were going to public schools, because in those days, the New York City, the Philadelphia, the Boston public schools were great. They were the best schools. So he had himself a quandary by, after being here a couple of years and graduating his first class, he graduates these guys, and then he thinks to himself, well, where are these guys going to work? How am I going to place them? So he realizes he needs a political arm of synagogues, so he has a place that he can place these guys. Because there were no female rabbis at that time. So he calls a meeting in 1913 in Manhattan, along with 3 of his closest confidants, to form what was then called the United Synagogue of America. Today we call it the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. Now, the 2 shuls in this area both belong, they're both conservative, Potsdam and Phoenixville. The 5 original, so 25 synagogues showed up, 22 voted yes, 3 declined, although all 3 joined later on. And also 3 universities were represented, of course the seminary, and 2 from Philadelphia, Gratz College and Dropsy College, which were both Jewish Hebrew school teacher training institutes at that time. Of the 22 original synagogues, conservative Judaism, 6 were from New York, 5 were from Philly, and the other 11, there was no more than 1 from any city. But they were very diverse cities: Montreal, St. Louis, Minneapolis, all over the country, and Canada. So I said there were 5 in Philadelphia. Does anybody have any idea which were the 5 original conservative synagogues in Philadelphia? Now I'm going to tell you this, they all existed before and were Orthodox, but they all decided to make the jump. Anybody have a clue? Anybody want to guess?
Har Zion, the one?
Yeah.
Har Zion was not founded until 20 years after this meeting.
Oh, okay.
But
That
it's
was
a
my
good guess,
too.
because it's a well-known
Yeah.
historic synagogue. Anybody else? All right, I'll tell you who they were. One was Adolf Jesher, which was located on Broad Street at the time, of course, is now in Elkins Park. The second was Mikveh Israel that I mentioned before, which was a Sephardic Orthodox congregation, voted to come along, and then 20 years later reverted back to Orthodoxy, which it is still today. The third was a synagogue called Beth Israel. Has anybody heard of Beth Zion, Beth Israel on 18th and Spruce in Philadelphia? Well, that's the Beth Israel part. That's a merger of 2 synagogues. The fourth was this congregation called Ohel Jacob, which was located at 7th and Columbia in North Philly. Later moved in 1959 to Castor Avenue in Northeast Philly, and then eventually closed as that neighborhood changed dramatically also. So who was the 5th? Okay, this is the cover of the book. This is the 5th. It's congregation Beth El in Wynwood. The Beth El part, which was in West Philadelphia at the time, was the 5th. So the United Synagogue was founded by, I'm stressing the United Synagogue because I know both of the shuls up here are conservative. The United Synagogue was founded by 4 key people. The first, of course, was Schechter, that I mentioned before. He was the visionary. The second was his foremost disciple and a member of his first graduating class at the seminary. His name was Rabbi Elias Solomon, and he officiated in my bar mitzvah. My bar mitzvah in 1957, he died in 58. The third, would you believe in 1913 was a woman? Now think back to Orthodox Judaism, just starting conservative, and it's a woman in 1913. Anybody who knows Jewish history have a guess? A woman that was in the forefront prior to World War I? And the answer was Schechter's wife. Her name was Matilda Schechter. Now, the reason she had such great influence was she insisted she probably gave one of these every night. She said, Solomon, listen, 2 things you have to do in these newfangled synagogues. Number 1, there has to be a place for women, which there was not back in Europe, and even in England when they left England. And number 2, these synagogues have to have supplementary Hebrew schools because the kids go to public school, which they didn't do back in Europe. And he went along. He thought that was a good idea. So who was the 4th? Well, the 4th obviously was in Philadelphia. Also, I wouldn't bring it up. So the 4th was who I think was the most influential Jew in Jewish history from Philadelphia. Obviously not Benjamin Franklin, but I'm talking about in Jewish history. So his name was Cyrus Adler. He, for a living, was president of Dropsy College. He was an educator. Today, he could be, for example, the head of the Jewish Studies Department at Johns Hopkins. He was that kind of guy. He was a very interested in Jewish education. He also happened to be president of Mikveh Israel congregation at that time as a volunteer, just as synagogues today have presidents. I'll tell you a little bit about him. So he was born in Van Buren, Arkansas. Very strange for a Jewish guy to be born in Arkansas in 1860 something. So in '83, He graduated from the UP. He'd come here to go to college. He received the first American PhD in Semitic languages from Johns Hopkins in 1887. He taught Semitics at Hopkins until 1893, and he was then called to Washington to serve as the chief religion librarian at the Smithsonian Institute from 1892 to 1895. He was the founder of the National Jewish Welfare Board. He was the editor of the first English language edition of the Jewish Encyclopedia, and part of the committee that translated the Bible that's used in most Reform and Conservative synagogues today, the Jewish Publication Society Bible. It's the newest edition is called Eitz Chaim, but I know that all the conservative and most of the Reform use it. At the end of the First World War, he was invited by Woodrow Wilson to participate in the Paris Peace Conference because he was an expert on the different religions that were clashing in Europe, and they're trying to make a settlement. Fortunately for him, he didn't stay there the whole 9 months like Wilson did. Fortunately for him, the Paris Peace Conference was not the cause of his death like I'm convinced it was with Wilson. He only stayed a month, and he came back, and he went back to Dropsy College, where he was president from 1908 to 1940. He did take 2 years off when Schechter died in 1918 to serve as chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, but then he went back to Dropsy. He was a bachelor most of his life, always lived in downtown Philadelphia, always went to synagogue at Mikveh Israel, but married a young woman named Racy Friedenwald of Baltimore in 1905 when he was 48. They did have a daughter, Sarah, who spent her whole life as a bacheloress in Philadelphia teaching in Hebrew schools. When he died in Philadelphia in 1951, all his papers were donated to his alma mater, and they are at the University of Pennsylvania. So besides Mikveh Israel, what were the other great Orthodox synagogues? Well, one was B'nai Reuben that I mentioned before, the great Romanian synagogue, had over 1,000 families at one time. That was on 6th Street, I guess 2 blocks below Pine, 3 blocks, something like that. There was a synagogue called Knesset Israel Anshe Sfard, which means Knesset Israel, but we use Sephardic Nusach, Sephardic method of prayer, and that was located on Marshall Street. Now, Marshall Street is a small street between 5th and 6th, runs parallel to 5th and 6th. It was a very Jewish area, up until 1950, 55, I guess.
Where was Dropsy College?
Dropsy College was on North Broad Street, right next to the last Mikveh Israel building, which it still stands. You would have seen it, but unfortunately, my computer didn't work. And it's in the book. So K.I. Anshe Sfard was a very important Orthodox synagogue on Marshall Street. Another very important one was Ahavat Israel on North 16th Street in North Philadelphia. Now, why was this synagogue important? Not so much because it was big, but because the AIA, the American Institute of Architects Philadelphia chapter, in 1989, picked the 4 synagogues that they thought were most important architecturally of post-World War I synagogues. So the first one they picked was Ahavat Israel, and it's still standing. But the reason they picked it was because when the architect Louis Kahn, who's designed many synagogues, including mine, when Louis Kahn was given the commission, I guess you call it, he was faced with a plot. This is ridiculous. 30 feet across the street, as big as 2 row houses, and 2 blocks deep. And they said, build us a synagogue for 550 feet. Well, he did it. He did a nice job. Unfortunately, you can't appreciate it because the church that bought the building when they moved 40 years ago doesn't have the funds to maintain the building, and it's falling apart. It's a shame. But, it is what it is. And of course,
Your presentation's on this, right?
it's on a different one, but I have it.
Okay. Keep going, this will take a little bit.
All right, I'll give you the,
He's a miracle worker.
I don't know why I didn't think of this sooner.
here we go. Presentations in this illustration.
Okay, great.
We'll go back to the slide. So everybody likes stories, right? Especially if they're funny. So I'm going to tell you a few stories about various synagogues and Jewish communities in Philadelphia. Does everybody here remember hearing about a movie titled Throw Mama Off the Train?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so everybody's heard of it. Does anybody remember hearing about the sequel called Throw the Kosher Meat Off the Train? I don't think so, because it was never made. But I'm going to tell you the story of throwing the kosher meat off the train. So in 1909, there were 30 Jewish families in Coatesville. Everybody knows where Coatesville is, okay? What happened was, they had already formed a burial society, what we call a Hebrew Kadisha. They had already built a Jewish cemetery. And in 1909, they were halfway to finishing their building, which still stands on North Fifth Street in Coatesville. It's now a church, and they've since moved to, I guess it's Chester Springs outside of Coatesville. Still an active congregation. But getting kosher meat in Coatesville was an ordeal in 1909. The only way to the city, where the closest kosher butcher was the old Lancaster Pike, Route 30, Lancaster Avenue before it was there. From the city to Bryn Mawr, it was cobblestone. And from Bryn Mawr to Coatesville and farther out, all the way out to Gap, it was mud. It was an absolute ordeal to go into the city. So a couple of the men had an idea. We're going to go to the freight department of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which ran the train that ran from the city to Harrisburg, stopped in Coatesville, and we're going to make a deal with the freight department that our butcher's going to drop it off in Philly. We'll pay, the freight, and they'll drop it off in Coatesville. Sounds like a good idea, but good for the railroad, good for them. So they go to the railroad, and they forgot one thing. The railroads were very anti-Semitic in those days. And the railroad guy said to them, thanks for coming, but we don't need your business. So they couldn't do it that way. One of them had a great idea. And I spoke to his grandson, that's where I got the story. And by the way, the gentleman who the story is about and his son were both presidents of Beth Israel Coatesville, past presidents, of course. So his idea was, look, him and two of his buddies are going to ride the train from Philly to Coatesville the next Thursday, because that's the day they want the delivery, so they'd have to meet for Shabbos, the Sabbath. And we're going to look for a sympathetic-looking conductor, one that maybe we can bribe. And they find a guy. And he says, sure, I'll do it for X dollars. And they make an agreement. He says, but I got to talk to the engineer, because he's got to be involved. He talks to the engineer, and the engineer says, look, I'm happy to do it for my cut, but in those days, you had what were called station agents. Every station had a freight agent and a passenger agent. Today, you're lucky if there's a machine to buy a ticket. But in those days, that's how it was. I mean, I remember it. I'm not that old. So anyway, the engineer said, the only thing I can do is you can sneak it on in Philadelphia. That's up to you, the conductor. But he said, I'm not stopping having the meat come off the train in Coatesville. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to slow down the train between Coatesville and Gap. You're going to throw the meat off the train, and the guys from the synagogue are going to stand there and catch it, or at least get it. And that's how they had kosher meat in Coatesville from 1909 to 1912. And that's a true story. Does anybody have an idea? There was one synagogue building in this area, Philadelphia area, that was built as a synagogue. The synagogue moved, and they sold it to a church. And then the church moved and sold it to a mosque. So it's been a synagogue, a church, and a mosque. Anybody have a clue? And it's not that old, by the way. It was dedicated as a synagogue in 1945. So it's not like one of these old historic buildings in Philadelphia. So the answer is Temple Sinai, which is now in Dresher, Montgomery County. That was their first building. It was on Limekiln Pike in West Oak Lake. So what are the great population shifts among Jews in the area over time? In 1963, not that terribly long ago, this is like, when I say some of us were probably in high school or college, 1963. There were 22 conservative and 4 Reform synagogues in Northeast Philadelphia. Today there are 0 Reform and 1 conservative. There are still a few very small Orthodox, and they cater primarily to the Russian Jewish community. The reason there's still a Russian Jewish community in Northeast Philadelphia, although it's very small, is the same reason that there's always a small part of a successful community left behind. And unfortunately, these are the Russian Jews that came here in the 70s and didn't make it. So they're still stuck. I shouldn't say stuck, they're still living in Northeast Philadelphia, whereas most of their compatriots have moved out to the suburbs. So the one conservative synagogue left is Congregation Shar HaShamayim on Veree Road in Northeast Philadelphia. And it represents the mergers of 14 synagogues in one building. As synagogues closed, what did they do if they were conservative? They merged into Shar HaShamayim. You can see the memorial plaques from 14 different synagogues. If you go to Shar HaShamayim. At one time, there were 34 synagogues in Strawberry Mansion. Today, there are none. North Philadelphia and the Oak Point areas of Philadelphia at one time had 55 synagogues. Today, Bethel of Lauber Street, 7800 Lauber, is the last man standing, or last woman standing. And why is that one synagogue left? Because that's an African-American Jewish synagogue. But it's legit. It's a real synagogue with a real rabbi, and 85% of the members are African-American. They've all been converted properly, and it's a very interesting place. West Philadelphia in the late 60s had 60 synagogues. Today, there are one. And the reason there's one, by 1999, there were none. When a small synagogue started near the UP called Kol Emet, rented space in the church. They got some traction. Most of the members are employees of the UP or Drexel or the hospitals in the area, and they have a legit synagogue going on. Plus, both Drexel and Penn Hillels maintain services, both Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative. They both have a lot of large Jewish populations. So it's sort of come back a little bit in West Philly. The areas with the biggest population growth among Jews are very distinctly the Main Line and Center City. The Jewish population of Lower Merion Township has grown from under 300 in 1946 when the war ended to 500 in 1955 to 22,000 today. Now the whole town is 60,000 people, 22,000, and it's probably more because that's who self-identify as being Jewish. There may be others whose mothers were Jewish, which makes them Jewish, but they don't identify as anything. Or this way, they might identify as their spouse's religion if it's a mixed marriage. Oh, wait. Thank God for library directors. What can I tell you?
He's a miracle worker.
Thank you very much, Paul. All right, we'll get to this in a minute. So today there are 14 bricks and mortar synagogues in Lower Merion Township, hard to believe. 2 Reform, 4 Conservative, and 10 Orthodox, all with their own buildings. I'm not talking about little groups that meet in somebody's basement. Center City has seen new Jewish excitement from Mikveh Israel. It's growing again. Road of Shalom, which is still huge, on Broad and Wallace, Philadelphia, by far the largest Reform synagogue in the city. BZBI, Beth Zion, Beth Israel, I mentioned Beth Israel before. 18th and Spruce is growing. Society Hill Synagogue is growing. And there are 2 Chabad sponsored. Anybody who doesn't know what Chabad is? All right. So Chabad is a outreach group, very right-wing Orthodox Jews from Brooklyn, and they feel it's their mission to bring lost Jews back to Judaism. So what they do is they send young rabbis with their wives from Brooklyn to various communities and say, start a new synagogue. They send them with a checkbook to get started and bring back the lost Jews. Some of them don't just bring back lost Jews, some of them steal members from existing congregations. That's another story. So anyway, Chabad has 2 synagogues that they've taken over and run and are doing well in Center City. One is, I'm trying to think. One is called the Vilna Congregation, and the other is Beth Abraham which is a magnificent looking building, and they've restored it, they spent a lot of money on it. All right. So what were the first synagogues in each of the counties that I wrote about? I already told you that Mikveh Israel was Philadelphia's first. Now, let's see if somebody can guess some of these. Does anybody have an idea what was the first synagogue in Bucks County? Now think of the towns in Bucks where you know there were a few Jews. Can anybody think? I'll give you a hint. 1899. Okay, Bristol Jewish Center in Bristol. Bristol was very Jewish up until 1955, 1960. Now, 15 years ago, the synagogue closed, because now there were literally no Jews, and merged with Beth El of Yardley, which is up the river from Bristol. So what is the oldest continuously operating synagogue in Bucks? Well, it still exists, obviously, because it's continuously operating. Founded in 1921. A picture of the original charter is in the book. Tifereth B'nai Israel, located in Warrington, Bucks County. Fairly strong, over 300 families. So what was Chester County's first? Now, we're in Chester County. So who thinks they know what was the first synagogue founded in Chester County? Nobody knows? Close. It's third. All right, the first was Beth Israel of Coatesville, 1909. Eventually moved to Chester Springs. The second was Kesher Israel of Westchester, also moved from downtown Westchester a little bit further out. And the third was B'nai Jacob of Phoenixville. Those were the first three. Just to read from the book, I'm not going to read your passage. These are the towns in Chester that either have or have synagogues. Berwyn, Chester Springs, Coatesville, Devon, Malvern, Phoenixville, Spring City, Westchester, and that's it. Those are the towns that either have or have had synagogues in Chester County. Now bear in mind the Jewish population of Chester County is about 22,000. Both Montgomery's about 65,000, Bucks is about 60,000, what less, 58,000, and then Delaware County lags far behind. Because it's the demographics of Delaware County, there really are three decent-sized synagogues, and two are in Brooklyn, and one's in Wallingford. Maybe you would consider decent-sized. That's about it. Now we're ready to play the game. Okay, I'm going to show you, some of them are current synagogues, some of them are synagogues that the buildings still exist, but they've been repurposed, and some are buildings that have been ripped down. I'll give hints.
It's a mouse.
Left
Just
button,
have
it's a
to
mouse.
have it on the
Left
table.
button.
Oh, you have to have it on the table.
Point it.
You don't have to have it on the table.
Well,
Left, just hit the left button of the mouse. There you go.
Okay.
Okay. I'll give you the hint on this one. Argoy Street in Germantown. Obviously no longer a synagogue. Obviously a church there. Ramat El closed in 1959.
Left button.
It's just slow.
Went way far ahead. Too far ahead.
Too far ahead.
I'm working with my clicker since I have Cologne.
No. How far ahead are we? Oh, way ahead.
We should be back up to number 3.
Probably was doing something when you were clicking. It just wasn't, didn't respond right away.
That's why I'm here.
Yeah.
Okay, this is number 3. Anybody know it?
Is that on Almy Avenue? No.
Old York Road, just before you get to Cheltenham, as you go up Old York Road from the city, Temple Judea, the third Reformed synagogue founded in Philadelphia after KI and Rhoda Shoulder. 30 years ago, the demographics of North Philly changed and they merged with KI in Elkins Park. Existing and a large congregation today.
Is it Greenwood?
No.
No?
Addis Jessurun's current building in Elkins Park. Okay, this is the back of KI, which is rented to a congregation called Melrose B'nai Israel. Melrose B'nai Israel's neighborhood changed. They were in Cheltenham. They had about 100 families left. They sold the building, and they rent space from KI, which is happy to have them because their membership is declined and they need the money. So it's a good marriage. That's the front of KI. I'll show you 3 views and then we'll tell you what it is. Second. That's it. Old York Road Temple, Bethel, a large Reformed congregation in Abington on Old York Road. I talked before about 7th and Cecil B. Moore. This was Addis Jessurun's third of 5 buildings. This is another view of that building. And this is the front. So you'll see, it says on the top, engraved into the building, Congregation of El Jacob. And remember I told you that when Addis Israel moved, they sold their building to El Jacob. So that's what's still engraved in the building. And it also has the name of the poor church that can't unfortunately maintain the building properly. That's why it's not as grand as it was. Right, this is a memorial garden for this synagogue. I'll give you a hint, it's the largest Orthodox synagogue in metropolitan Philadelphia, by far. Old Lancaster Road in Ballackinwood, the Lower Merion Synagogue. Gee, I wonder what the name of this place is. Anybody know where it is? It's on Lancaster Avenue, Merion. Actually, it's on Old Lancaster Road, not on Lancaster Avenue. Kol Emet, the Reformed congregation on High School Road in Elkins Park. I talked before about Ahavas Israel being one of the 4 synagogues that were recognized for architectural excellence. Here's number 2, because of the dome. Okay, this was designed by the famous architect Pedro Palucci, the only synagogue he ever designed. It's the mainline Reformed congregation in Winnie. Here's another view. So what were the other 2 synagogues recognized? Well, one is kind of a no-brainer. If you know, can anybody think of a famous architect that designed the synagogue in the Philadelphia area?
Frank Lloyd Wright.
Frank Lloyd Wright. So Frank Lloyd Wright designed
Is that AJ? No.
Best
Shalom.
Shalom. Best Shalom of Elkins Park. That's number 3. And number 4, Bethel Bethel in Winwood. Not for this, but for this, which you can't really see because of the unique tent-shaped ceiling in the sanctuary. This is the Beth David Reformed Congregation in Gladwin. Three views. Har Zion Temple in Penn Valley. This building no longer exists. It was at 2100 North Broad. There's a McDonald's there now. This was the last building of Adith Jesher before they moved to Elkins Park. This building was at 63rd or Cobbs Creek Parkway and Ludlow, right near the elevated as it goes through West Philadelphia. This was the West Philadelphia Jewish Center, now part of Temple Bethel, Bethel and Wynwood through merger. Oops, we missed one.
You can click on the back arrow, that's, yeah.
All right, there are two that I consider hideous from an architectural standpoint. You can be sure this is one of them. The building is no longer there. Remember I showed you before, I said this congregation rents from KI? Well, this was their building. It was called Melrose B'nai Israel, and it was on Cheltenham Avenue, on the Cheltenham side of Cheltenham Avenue. Great congregation, their building. Obviously, this is Temple Israel. The question is where?
Upper Darby.
Upper Darby, good. Somebody got one.
You can bring up that menu, oh, there you go.
This was probably the most famous architecturally designed synagogue outside of Frank Lloyd Wright in Philadelphia. This was the Frank Furness, well-known architect, designed original road of Sholem. I don't know how they did it or why they did it, but they ripped it down to build their current building 70 years ago. But this should still be there. It's a shame. And it was very deep. It went all the way back, 2 blocks. This is a huge, well, they had 2,000 families. And all the rich Jews in Philadelphia belonged here. This was the place to go on the higher holidays. The men wore top hats. It was quite an interesting place. Again, the West Philadelphia. And here's a grand building that unfortunately was not saved. This was the 3rd of 5 homes of Knesset Israel KI. That's now in Elkins Park. This was probably their largest building. It's a shame this wasn't saved.
Where was that?
That was on North Broad Street, around between 2000 and 3000. North Broad Street on the west side. This is a drawing, it's not a photograph. This was KI's first building, built in 1797 or 8. 4th and Brown, no longer there, of course. That Adith Israel I showed you before, this was the Daily Chapel. All right, this is Rock Hall of Temple University, obviously. But what was it before Temple University bought it 50 years ago? What was it built as? It was built as the Hebrew school of Adith Jesher. Here's the other architectural monstrosity. Now that's engraved into the building. That's not somebody's drawing. So it's pretty hideous. This was Temple Beth Torah, which was located on Welsh Road, where Philadelphia meets Huntington Valley. Gee, I wonder what the name of this place was. Beth Am Israel. So Beth Am Israel was founded on Warrington Avenue in southwest Philadelphia. In 1965, they moved to Penn Valley, Pennsylvania, and built this building. 20 years later, they needed to expand. They ripped it down and built a more modern building after 20 years. Here's the last one. Also, this is in Overbrook Park, Philadelphia. Congregation Bet HaMidrash, which moved from Marchwood Street in West Philly to here. And in 2000, as Overbrook Park no longer had enough Jewish families to support a synagogue, they merged into Adith Israel of the main line. So I guess that's ira Guesses and Synagogues for tonight. So let's get back to where we were. The only county I didn't ask you was Delaware County. Does anybody have an idea of was the first synagogue in Delaware County?
Maybe something in Chester?
It was. Right, Beth Israel of Chester was founded in 1898. It only lasted a few years, and in 1905, I think it was, they merged into a synagogue founded in 1902, which still exists, and that's Oheb Shalom, which left Chester 40 years ago, but is still very active in Wallingford. A lot of faculty from Swarthmore College belong there, and it's quite an erudite, quality synagogue. Now we come down to the last county, is Montgomery County. This is the hardest one to guess. Anybody have an idea which was the first synagogue in Montgomery County? The answer is Chesed Shel Emet at Pottstown. As I mentioned before, it's the only pre-1900 synagogue. Still there, although they've sold their building because their membership is down, and they rent back part of the building, but they rent back what they need, so they're doing fine for the amount of people that they have. So most historians refer to the outer ring original synagogues of Pottstown, Norristown, Westchester, Coatesville, Lansdale, and Bristol as the original 6. Of course, today Lansdale, Norristown, and Bristol are gone. Norristown and Lansdale have merged into Blue Bell, and only Westchester and Pottstown remain in their original form, although in different buildings farther from the downtown center of the towns. Almost all of these early outer ring suburban synagogues were founded by merchants. Almost all of the original department stores in the Philadelphia suburbs were founded by Jews, including the New York store in Pottstown. The facade is still there. It says New York store, but it's something else now. Chatlin's in Norristown. Lay's, which had 3 stores, Coatesville, Quakertown, and Allentown. And it should be noted also that Boscov's of Reading, Hess of Allentown, York's Globe store, and the recently departed Bonton stores of Scranton Wilkes-Barre were also all Jewish owned, and they were intertwined. For example, Al Boscov, who founded Boscov's of Reading, was first cousins with the guy who founded the Globe store in York. And almost all of them are buried in the same cemetery, the German Jewish Cemetery in Port Richmond on Richmond Street, Mount Sinai Cemetery. Very small but elegant cemetery. You'll also see buried there Snellenberg, remember Snellenberg's in Philly, Litz, and Gibbon, all buried in that cemetery. And they were, almost all of them were members of Rhoda Shalom at the time. So what's the future of the synagogues in Philadelphia? Well, I'm going to tell you, several mergers are in discussion as we sit here tonight. The amount of people who self-identify as Jewish in the 5 counties is dropping. So for some synagogues, the end is not if, but when. Those that act on time will do the responsible thing and merge before it's too late and it becomes a financial problem for both synagogues, the one closing and the one accepting them, and a real headache. If you ask me what things are going to be like in 20, 30, or 50 years, my best guess is that we're going to have a few super synagogues among the Reform and Conservative movements, a few small Orthodox synagogues throughout the city, except for Lower Merion and Center City, where there'll still be probably many, because Orthodox synagogues tend to be either rabbinic-centric, in other words, they follow a certain rabbi, or they follow, if you have, you know, they used to say if you had 2 Jews, you had 2 Chinese restaurants. Today, I say if you have 2 Orthodox Jews, you have 2 synagogues. Because they never get it together to all be together. And that's okay, but that's how they die. So I'll give you 2 quick answers and then take a couple questions. So what are some answers? One is the Dell experiment, Dell Computers. Okay, so Richard Dell, the son of the founder, grew up in Austin, Texas, which always had a steady but not large Jewish population. When he was growing up, there were 4 synagogues and a JCC. Each of the 4 were in aging buildings built for congregations much larger than what they had at that time. The JCC building was falling apart. So what Richard Dell said to them was, called the meeting of all 4 synagogues and the JCC, "You're going to buy 100 acres of land in the suburbs where most of the Jewish families live. You're going to sell your buildings and you're going to move to the Dell campus and you're going to save a lot of money." How are we going to do that? Because when you come here, you're each going to build a building that includes a place for services. In other words, whatever you contemplate your membership is going to be, that's how big the sanctuary should be. No daily chapel. You can have daily services in the big synagogue. And office space for your clergy and office staff. That's it. We're going to build a common building. Instead of you each having 15 classrooms that you don't use and have to worry about running, we're going to build one building with 15 classrooms. Synagogue A is going to go on Monday. Synagogue B is going to go on Tuesday, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to share the same classrooms. We're going to build one grand ballroom, which can be used for weddings, bar mitzvahs, large community events, large synagogue events. Out of respect for the conservative and the reconstructionists, the reform agreed that the kitchen would be kosher. And the JCC connected to that common building. Well, how's it going? 20 years later, a fellow member of my synagogue went down to Austin because his son was doing the clerkship for a judge there. And he went because his son belonged to one of the synagogues. It's thriving, it's doing very well. And each synagogue has a footprint a lot smaller than they had before, and they're very happy. So it can be done. The same thing is going on now in Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, in north central Pennsylvania, where we have 4 aging synagogues and an aging JCC attempting the same thing. And it's being contemplated in Oceanside, Long Island, which also has a lot of aging synagogues. Another quick way to keep a synagogue building alive is building sharing. 2 quick examples. Kasich, however, in Pottstown sold their building, got a fair amount of money for it, invested the money, used the investment money to pay a part-time rabbi, and to make sure they have money for the rent for enough years that they'll hang on. Because the average age is getting up there. There are no kids. Well, I should say there are very few kids in the congregation. Another idea is, similar idea, as I said before, KI on Old York Road, building built for 1,500 families, down to half that. So they rent part of the building to that synagogue in Shelby. So if I have one word of advice for the newer groups that started out, like the group in Malvern, or the group that's attempting to build a building, the Second Synagogue in Westchester, that's meeting on a farm right now. They want to build a building. Don't overbuild. Because the day's going to come when your neighbor's going to change too. So I want to remind you that upon completing the few questions and answers that we have time for, I will sit in the back where my wife is, and I hope you'll buy the book, because I don't get paid for this. And of course I'll sign it for you, dedicated whoever you like. But first, and I will also have copies of my previous book, Synagogues of Long Island, if you're from New York, which won the first place award at the National Convention of Indie Bookstores, the Best Books Festival in Vegas last year, and it won first place in the category of religion general. So that's pretty good for a first time. Now, entertain your questions. Try to keep them about your old synagogues you know about, or neighborhoods you know about. Questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Please join me.